The American Revolution was inspired by the French philosophers. The American Revolution is the ideal Enlightenment revolution. But now it's going to go full circle, and it's going to inspire revolution in France. The French Revolution is going to be much bloodier. The success of the American Revolution made many people in France believe they could have a revolution as well. After all, with their assistance, the Americans had thrown off the shackles of royalty. Why couldn't the French do the same thing? After all, these Enlightenment ideas were French ideas. In the midst of all this, there were lots of problems in France. Debt was out of control. France had been fighting major wars against England and Prussia. And the Enlightenment ideas of John Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire, they're exploding onto the firmament there in France. And people want to have that same liberty, that same freedom. The French middle class also wanted representation. They felt like the middle class, the third estate of France, wasn't given the voice in government they wanted to. And amongst all this, we had a very cool couple of years. And food shortages happened because of the shorter growing seasons. People were facing higher taxes and less food. When you put all this together, you have the perfect recipe for a revolution. The government in France was a little different than what we're used to in the United States and England. The government did have an absolute king. This king did have absolute power, but there were also kind of a form of a parliament. It's called the EstatesGeneral. The first estate was made up of members of the clergy, priests, nuns, abbots. Your second estate were your noblemen, your landowners, your military leaders, your ministers to foreign governments. And the third estate was everyone else. It was the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the peasants. The third estate was by far the largest of the three, but its vote was equal to the first two estates, and in the end, the king had absolute say anyway. The EstatesGeneral was a little different than Congress or Parliament. The EstatesGeneral only met when it was called forth by the king, and its major purpose was to pass tax laws. That was one of the limits of powers that the King of France, in theory, had. The EstatesGeneral had a history of arguing with the king, so no king had called it since the year 1614. It's now 1789, and these members of the EstatesGeneral feel like they've been ignored, and they had, again, since 1614. But in May of 1789, the king needs money to fight his foreign wars, and he needs the EstatesGeneral to meet to raise taxes. He calls the EstatesGeneral for the first time, and this was a big mistake. Because the third estate, that estate made up of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the peasants, they feel like their voice isn't being heard. Even though they greatly outnumber the clergy and the noblemen, their vote is only 1/3 of the power. So their solution was that they established what they call the National Assembly. The king locked them out of the houses of government, so they met on a tennis court. And right there they made what we call the tennis court oath, where they promised to bring about a national constitution, a constitution based on Enlightenment ideas. If there was a scar on France, it was the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison, but not just any prison. It didn't just hold common prisoners, it held political dissidents. Anyone who spoke against the king could be locked up without trial in this Bastille. The people of Paris hated it, and the people of Paris felt revolution in the air. The very fact that the National Assembly had been created by this third estate shows that there was kind of a contagion of revolution. And on July 4th, 1789, a day that's gone down in history as Bastille Day, the people of Paris marched on the prison. They broke into the prison. They released the prisoners. They captured the weapon. And they even killed the prisoner's governor. Bastille Day is, at least officially, the start of the French Revolution. Out of loyalty to the Enlightenment ideas of natural rights, the National Assembly declared the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. Now, this was inspired by the United States' own Declaration of Independence, but it's going to go a little further. It's going to declare an end to all special privileges for the First and Second Estate. And on August 4th of 1789, the nobles agreed to give up all their feudal dues. They gave up their exemption from taxation, and they agreed that all males in France could hold office. You no longer had to have military service or be a member of the church. Everyone was free to. Now, there were no rights for women. The Declaration of Rights of Men only applied to men. But in 1791, there was a Declaration of Rights of Women that was issued by Olympe de Gouges. It was never adopted by France. That's not to make you think that the women weren't important to the revolution. Women were incredibly important. Oftentimes the women were the glue that held the revolution together. In fact, there was what we call the bread march of women, where women who were trying to raise families that were starving to death in this time period marched on the government offices. They were carrying pitchforks as thousands of women marched to Versailles. King Louis escaped, and he took his government to Paris. In 1791, the National Assembly adopted a new constitution. This constitution of 1791 kept the monarchy, but it made it a constitutional monarchy. It limited the king's power greatly. There's a lot of unrest in the community, and this unrest broke out into violence as you had the Jacobites that were out there fighting for less monarchy, and you had the Girondins out there fighting for more monarchy. France was really in a civil war at this time, and the person that probably saw it the best was Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was the Queen of France, and she begs her husband to flee. We have to escape. If we don't escape, they'll kill us. Finally, in June of 1791, the king and the queen flee for Austria, but they're captured before they got out of France. They're held as prisoners and forced to sign documents accepting the new laws of the legislature. In August of 1792, a rump version of the Parliament, this is not a complete legislature, a partial legislature meets to discuss suspending the monarchy. And in September of 1792, the National Convention meets in full. They dissolve the monarchy, and they established the French Republic. Again, not everybody's on this side. There was a document written called the Brunswick Manifesto. The Duke of Brunswick was a leader of both Austrian and Prussian forces, and he sent this open letter to the people of Paris saying that if they accepted the king and the king and queen weren't harmed, he wouldn't harm the Parisian people. He believed this was standing up for the old system, standing up for monarchy. It didn't work out very well. In January of 1793, the National Convention accused the king of treason. They then convicted him of treason and sentenced him to death. And on January 21st of 1793, the king's head was cut off by guillotine. This is when what we call the Thermidorian reaction happens. Thermidorian means a thawing out. It's usually when a revolution kind of turns on itself. The revolution's in crisis because not everybody supports it. There are a lot of people that look around and say, we still have the same problems we had when we had a king. Why did we overthrow a king if we still have conscription? They were still forcing people to serve in the military. Only now they're serving in the military against fellow Frenchmen, the Jacobins against the Girondists. There are still food uprisings. People are still starving. And ultimately, the Jacobins are going to take over the National Convention. And the Girondists are going to be marked as enemies. And enemies are hunted down. We call this time period the Reign of Terror. In order to control the government better, a Committee on Public Safety was established. And the Jacobins used this Committee on Public Safety to target their political enemies. Anybody that was suspected of being a traitor was hunted down. They were put on show trials, and they were executed with the national razor, Madame Guillotine. Very few nobles were actually executed. There were about 40,000 people killed during the Reign of Terror. 85% of these people were either middle class or peasants. But there was a big exception. In October of 1793, Marie Antoinette, the former Queen of France, was executed. Her crime? She was accused of sending money to Austria, of trying to funnel funds out of France, funds that the French desperately needed. Ultimately, the Reign of Terror is going to turn on itself, and the members of the Committee of Correspondence, who had been led by Robespierre through all of this, suddenly Robespierre and Danton are fighting against each other. And when Robespierre himself is executed by the committee as an enemy of the state, the Reign of Terror collapses. The Constitution of the Year 3. It's an interesting name. France was so pleased with their revolution early on that they decided to rewrite their calendar, and they made the year of the revolution year 0. So this is the Constitution of Year 3 in the French calendar. This passes in 1795, and they established a 5-man directory to run France. The thought being, with all of the problems that are out here, we really need a smaller group to take control. The directory was made up of military men, and it acted as a dictatorship. It also used the army to control its enemies. What's ultimately going to end the directory? One young general, a man named Napoleon Bonaparte, seizes power from the directory. Napoleon Bonaparte is so effective and so charismatic that he's named the sole consul of France, a title we haven't seen since the days of Julius Caesar.